Hello, everybody. I'm Quiana Clark-Rowland, Executive Director for AACT. Sorry about my little noise in the background. We're very glad to have you on our webinar on HR and the First Family Cares Act. And we have with us Lynn Nelson. Lynn Nelson is going to do the introductions for our speaker today. Lynn Nelson is a AACT region rep, as well as a HR professional.
Hi, I'm Lynn Nelson. Like Quiana said, I'm a mild-mannered HR professional by day, and by night I do community theater. So I have been on the ACT board as region rep from the Southeastern Regional Conference for about 10 years now. And when Quiana sent me an email and asked me if I knew of anybody who would like to present on the HR issues related with COVID, I went, I sit next to in my church choir, I have a fellow alto who is a labor attorney. So I emailed her and said, Denisha, could you do this? And she said, oh, no. But I know two people who are extremely qualified to do so. And she led me to Manuel and Elizabeth Boone, who are with the Bradley firm. And I hope I've said that correctly. And she assured me that they were wonderful. And then when I started reading their bios, I thought, I believe I've heard both of them speak before. So they are very knowledgeable. And even though I've been in HR for almost 40 years, I will tell you, there's a lot that I don't know. And this is new territory for all of us. So I am going to learn as much as all of the rest of you today, listening to this from both Will and Elizabeth. So passing it off.
All right, are we ready to go ahead and share the presentation then? All right. All right, is everybody able to see that well? I have to give Will credit for the content and of the title here. He had a little bit of creativity in this, so I'll give credit where credit is due. But kind of one of the things that we're going to go through today is some available lending programs and some HR issues that you may be either working with for a lending facility, or if you're dealing with from an HR perspective. So we're going to hit a few different areas, and if you all have any questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and then we will be compiling those and answering them at the end of this presentation. So with that, I will start off with the agenda real quick. We're going to start off with the Paycheck Protection Program. Then we'll go on and talk about the economic injury disaster loans, the Main Street lending program, and then I'll turn it over to Will, who will do the return to work policies and safety, employee safety. Okay, so I know the Paycheck Protection Program has been in the news a lot lately, and so most of y'all, even if you haven't had the opportunity to apply for funds through this program, you may be aware of this program and know that it is put in place to basically help different small businesses and nonprofits, sole proprietors, and independent contractors receive money to help make sure that they can keep their employees employed during this unusual time. This program was implemented very, very quickly, and you can see based on this timeline that the CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th. And then you go ahead and have the first applications on April 3rd, additional applications on April 10th, and then the funds were exhausted by April 16th, and that's the first rounds of funds that came out under the CARES Act. Then Congress passed the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act on April 24th, and the SBA resumed accepting PPP and EIDL applications on April 27th. In the middle of all this happening as well, the Main Street lending programs came into play as well, and they were authorized by the Federal Reserve on April 8th, and then some term sheets were giving out, the latest of being on April 30th. Now these programs, there are 3 different ones, kind of have different audiences and have different people who can participate in them, and we'll go through that. But I think the purpose of this slide is really just to show you how quickly this has changed and is still changing. So we are giving you the information that we know as of today, but this area of law is quickly evolving and is something that we will need to pay attention to and make sure that any updates that come along are paid attention to and complied with. At the end of this presentation, I will give you links to the different locations for where these updates and additional information can be found. So let's dive on in. Okay, so the CARES Act ended up appropriating $349 billion in funds for PPP loans, and also appropriated $10 billion for expansion of grant money for EIDL loans. And those are the $10,000 grants that are options to be advanced under the EIDL loan program. And then after those funds were exhausted, which we talked about in the previous slide, then the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act was passed. And it provided for an additional $310 billion in funds for PPP loans, and an additional $50 billion for EIDL loans, and an additional $10 billion in EIDL grant money, which is that $10,000 advance that I just spoke about. So it's a lot of money. However, as you can see from the timeline that we showed earlier, the funds have gone quickly. I heard a quote from someone at the SBA saying that they did 14 years of SBA loans in 14 days. So they've been very, very busy and trying to work with people to get them the funds that they need. So for the Paycheck Protection Program loans, there are a pool of applicants that are eligible for this, and it's expanded from who would traditionally be eligible for an SBA loan under the regular 7A loans of the SBA. They've expanded it to include independent contractors, sole proprietors, and eligible self-employed individuals. And they've also included nonprofits as well. So you kind of take the original people who would be qualified for an SBA loan and add a bunch of different groups on top of that are also eligible, which is great because it provides money and programs that are available to different groups which normally wouldn't be able to get SBA loans. So if you were operational on February 15th, and if you're a small business concern, which is either 500 or fewer employees with their principal residence in the US, or businesses with a maximum tangible net worth of not more than 15 million, with the average net income after federal income taxes for 2 years prior to the application being not more than 5 million, then you will qualify. Also, there are some other size standards that can be used that are industry specific. So if you don't fall into one of these categories, there is a tool on the SBA website that will actually allow you to go and check your industry to see if there's a different kind of qualification tool that applies to your business. And as I mentioned before, they've also expanded it to nonprofits, tax exempt veterans organizations, tribal business concerns, and independent contractors, sole proprietors, and eligible self-employed individuals. They have excluded private equity firms and hedge funds from PPP loan eligibility. So one of the tricky things about SBA loans is that they apply a lot of affiliation rules. And these affiliation rules basically make it so that if you as an entity have affiliates who have control over the operation of your entity, so those would be related legal entities, if they meet certain criteria, then the employee count and the revenue count that's associated for qualifying for these loans are all aggregated. So you would take not just your business, but also your affiliated businesses as well that fall into these certain criteria. And all of those would come together to determine the employee count and revenue for that business. It's a good thing to know. It's very fact specific. So if it's something that you think will apply to you, then I suggest that you take a deeper dive into this and check into it. But this slide just kind of lets you know that it's there and to keep an eye out for it. There also is an SBA interim final rule on affiliation and also frequently asked questions and the associated answers that will give more information. And that's on the websites that I will give you links to later. Okay, so once you figure out if you're an eligible borrower, the next thing you want to figure out is how much money you can get. And under these loans, you can get 2.5 times the average monthly payroll costs. And the average monthly payroll costs are determined by averaging the 12-month period prior to the loan date or the average monthly payroll costs in 2019. Regardless of what your payroll costs are, the maximum loan amount is $10 million. And if you have a seasonal business, or if you've had a new business that wasn't in business all of the past 12 months or for all of 2019, then you can have alternate calculations that can be used instead. And those are detailed in the regulations. When you're doing your compensation or payroll cost determinations, the compensation is capped at $100,000 per employee on an annualized basis. And also independent contractors are not included in payroll costs. If your business is set up as a partnership, then the self-employed partner, their self-employment income should be included as payroll costs, and the partnership should make the application, not the individual partners. And this also applies to entities that are taxed as partnerships as well. So you figured out your loan amount, that you're eligible, then the terms of your loan are going to be a 1% interest rate with the 2-year maturity, and your payments are going to be deferred for 6 months. However, the interest still accrues during that time. So something that's kind of a hot topic right now is the loan forgiveness, because of the timeline of these loans, there's an 8-week period after the disbursement within which you get to spend funds, and if you use them for authorized purposes, and provided there a certain percentage of them is used for payroll costs, then you can apply to your lender for forgiveness of that piece of loan. So it ends up being a grant instead of an actual loan that you have to be repaid. And that's for the portion that falls into this authorized category. So after you receive the funds, like I mentioned before, you have an 8-week period within which to spend these funds, and it would be that they were incurred and payments were made for payroll costs, utilities, mortgage interest, or rent, and any other authorized expenditure. They must be used for these permissible purposes in order to be forgiven, and in order for these loans to be determined to be used for authorized purposes. And also there's a cap on the amount of forgiveness, and the fact that 75% of the forgiveness amount has to be attributed to payroll costs. So you can get up to the full amount of the loan and interest paid back to you, but the kicker is that you have to have at least 75% of that amount be only for payroll costs. And then you can have the remaining 25% of the forgiven amount be for the other things such as utilities, mortgage interest, or rent. So one of the biggest things on this is to make sure that you are documenting the funds and how they're being expended, because this is going to be requested from your lender. And they are going to ask that you provide them exactly how the funds were spent, give you documentation of the payroll costs, and provide a lot of information to ensure that the loan forgiveness is proper. As I mentioned through this program, you actually deal with a lender who goes to the SBA. That's a little different from the EIDL loans, which are directly with the SBA. But this is going to be an interaction with your lenders. So you go and apply for the loan with your lender, you go to them for forgiveness purposes as well, and they hold your loan after that. As we mentioned before, you've got an 8-week period after the disbursement to make the expenditures that can be forgiven, and the loan disbursement must be within 10 days from the loan application. There are also 2 other additional things that can come into play when you're determining your forgiveness amount. If the workforce is reduced at your company, then that can decrease the amount of forgiveness that's given. Also, if employee compensation is reduced by more than 25%, then that can reduce the amount of your forgiveness as well. There are detailed calculations in the regulations on how this occurs. And additionally, we are expecting in the next few days to receive a good amount of feedback from the SBA on the forgiveness process. I participated in a town hall meeting the other day with SBA, and they had mentioned that the forgiveness information and additional details would be on the forefront of what they were going to tackle. So we are hoping that in the next few days, we end up getting some additional information on this forgiveness that gives us more more direction as to how this forgiveness process will work. Okay, so after you have determined you've got your loan amount and that you're eligible, then you're going to turn in your application. And when you turned in your application, either you've already turned it in, or if funds are still available, you still may be able to turn in an application. And based on what I've heard, they are still accepting applications now. They're going to make you make multiple certifications, and these have kind of been hot topics in the law recently because these certifications have been kind of brought to the forefront and have caused several businesses to actually turn their funds back in. So there are multiple certifications. We're just going to talk about a few. The first one is that to the extent feasible, you have to purchase only American-made equipment and products. The second one is any EIDL loans received between January 31st of 2020 and April 3rd of 2020 had to have been used for a purpose other than payroll costs and other eligible expenses under PPP. And then the third one is the one that is receiving so much attention lately. And this is the certification that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. And these representations and certifications were made at the time of the application, and by its nature, it's an uncertain time. And so I think a lot of businesses weren't sure exactly how this was going to play out. The SBA has given additional guidance since the original application was put out and after the original final interim rule was put out as well, that has kind of given some different guidelines as to what is necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. We're going to go into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. The final one is that certification that we're going to talk about is that the PPP funds will be used to retain workers and maintain payroll or make mortgage interest payments, lease payments, and utility payments. This is something to note. If funds are used for unauthorized purposes, so if they're not used for these specific items that we've just talked about, then the applicant may be held legally liable, which may include charges of fraud. So just be sure that when you receive these funds that you use them for the proper purposes, and you shouldn't have any problems. Okay. So this is going back to the hot topic that I just mentioned before. You all may have seen that Shake Shack has been in the news recently about the fact that it returned its PPP loans because of the fact that it didn't feel like it was necessary for their operations. So let's walk through this and kind of detail it out more. I think, most organizations, especially those of you who are in the theater business, you are being hit very hard by this, and it's very easy to show that you have had repercussions from the COVID virus, and that that funds may be needed for this. But it's very good to document why you think that this is necessary. And maybe it's because your revenues have fallen, or maybe it's because you have less attendance at your events, or you have different kinds of certain criteria that you normally would show that you're profitable, but you are not profitable anymore. Or you've had to suspend some programs or different things of that nature. So what I would recommend is making sure that you put something in your file to say, hey, this is why we thought it was necessary at the time, and this is what we based our decision on. And that way, if for whatever reason you're audited at a later time, then you will have that information readily available, and you can just present that to the auditor and know that you've got your background information. So the guidance that was given by the SBA that caused there to be some confusion and some concern was that they said that the borrowers must make this certification in good faith, taking into account their current business activity and their ability to access other sources of liquidity sufficient to support their ongoing operations in a manner that is not significantly detrimental to the business. And they specifically say that it's unlikely that a public company with a substantial market value and access to capital markets would be able to make the required certification in good faith. One of the things that this has done, as I mentioned before, is just made it to where you need to make sure that you can prove, or at least have good evidence on the fact that you do need these funds. One of the other additional guidance pieces that they have provided is that all PP loans of more than $2 million will be audited, but they didn't just limit the auditing to $2 million and above. It will also be, other entities will also be audited as determined appropriate by the SBA. So as I mentioned before, your best friend in this is a file that has all of your documentation in it, right? That tells not only why you found these funds to be necessary, but how much you received, what it was spent for, how the forgiveness process worked, and if for some reason you're audited, then you'll have all the information that's needed and you can present that. There also is a safe harbor in place that if for whatever reason you're not comfortable with this requirement that it has to be necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant, then you can repay the loan amount in full by May 14th of 2020, and you will be deemed by the SBA to have made the required necessity certification in good faith. So that's just a safe harbor. If you feel like maybe at the time, you know, you weren't certain, and now maybe you're certain you don't need it, then you can return those funds and it's not a problem. Another thing to take into account as well that has come out of recent guidance is that the SBA does put limits on eligibility for loans based on corporate groups. And a corporate group under this guidance is defined as businesses that are majority owned directly or indirectly by a common parent. So if there are a bunch of different theater organizations that are actually affiliated through one main organization, and that would be through ownership, then they may all be considered part of the same corporate group. And if that is the case, then that corporate group is limited to $20 million in total PPP loans. And that is in addition to the affiliation rules that we talked about earlier. So it's not just the affiliation, which is the people who have control over your entity, but it's also ownership as well. So you've got two different tests that apply. And this limitation is effective immediately for all loans that were not dispersed as of April 30th of 2020. And if you do think that you fall into this category, you need to notify your lender and that you've applied for or received loans exceeding that limitation. And you need to withdraw the application or request cancellation. And failure to do that will be deemed using the funds for unauthorized purposes. Okay, so the second type of loan that we're going to talk about is an economic injury disaster loan. And this is an existing SBA program that has been around for quite some time. And there was a declaration that the COVID-19 crisis qualified as a disaster that would make individuals eligible for these types of loans. And these applications are actually done through the SBA website, and there's a portal there that you can use in order to apply for those loans. So the qualifications are a little bit different than the PPP loans, but it's similar. It's small business concerns, private nonprofit organizations, small agricultural cooperatives, and eligible entities. And you can see the eligible entities are using independent contractor and sole proprietorships, but also businesses with 500 or fewer employees. And I'm going to jump back to what we had talked about before about the affiliation rules, because the affiliation rules for determining the number of employees apply to this as well. So the affiliation rules are going to apply to every lending program that we're going to talk about today. So if you find out that you do have an affiliate you need to count for, then that affiliate will be determinative of your calculations for all three of these lending programs. So the EIDL loans, there's a $2 million maximum loan, and the interest rate will not exceed 4% per year. You also may receive a $10,000 advance, which if it's used for certain purposes can be forgiven. And those purposes include payroll, sick leave, rent, or mortgage payments. So the SBA loan portal and for these EIDL funds is similar to a normal bank application. It's a little bit more involved than the PPP application, but the website is set up pretty well and it's pretty easy to access. All right, so I know that most of you all are nonprofits, and I know there are a few that are not nonprofits. So this is a different program that is really catered not towards nonprofit, but towards for-profit businesses. But it is something that is being considered to be expanded to nonprofits as well. So Main Street Lending Program kind of, it involves the ability of larger amounts of funds. So what happened was the $75 billion equity investment was made by the Treasury into a special purpose vehicle, which was created by the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is purchasing participation in these loans, which is allowing up to $600 billion of loans to be put out into the small and mid-sized businesses. So there are 3 facilities that are available. 2 of them are new kinds of loans, the new and priority ones are, and the third kind is an expanded loan that basically allows you to expand an already existing loan and upsize it. But you have to have that underlying loan have at least 18 months remaining on it. And the new ones need to be originated after April 24th of 2020. So as we see a trend going with all of these different lending programs, one of the things is that you have to have an eligible borrower and an eligible lender. And there are definitions on that as well that are pretty intense. And so I'm not going to go into them in detail, but know that there are qualifications that need to be met. Currently, nonprofits are not eligible for this program, but I have seen commentaries stating that they're looking into whether or not nonprofits may be able to be included in the future. And the eligible borrower does include one of the 2 main criteria is up to 15,000 employees or up to $5 billion in 2019 annual revenue. So these can include more mid-sized businesses and small businesses. The businesses also have to be created or organized in the U.S. with significant operations and a majority of their employees in the U.S. This is a 4-year loan. The amortization of principal and the interest is deferred for 1 year. And the unpaid interest is capitalized. You've got an interest rate of LIBOR plus 3%, and you can prepay it without any penalty. And these loans can either be secured or unsecured. If the underlying loan for the expanded loan is a secured loan, then the collateral is used for both the underlying loan and the expansion. So to wrap this up, we just wanted to talk about the way this kind of interacts with a few different programs. So one of the big things is that this is a facility that can be used in addition to a PPP loan. So if you have obtained a PPP loan and you're looking for additional funding, then this may be a good option for you. As we mentioned before, the SBA affiliation rules do apply. And there are several different requirements and details associated with these loans. But if it's something that you're interested in, please reach out and I can provide you more information. One of the other things too is this loan program is not currently available. It is still in the implementation process, and we are hoping that it will be rolled out in the relatively near future. So if this is something you're interested in, you have the possibility to get in as soon as it gets up and running. So before that happens, there'll be some additional clarifications which will help us all figure out how to use these the best. As I promised earlier, I have listed on here the different websites that will be useful for you to not only get information, but get updates as well. Treasury.gov is a great place to get information on the PPP loans. FederalReserve.gov is a great place to get information on the Main Street lending. SBA.gov is the place where you actually submit for EIDL loans. And there also is at www.buildsmartbradley.com. We are constantly putting out, maybe not constantly, but very frequently putting out articles about this issue. So if you are looking to find out any information about any new developments on this, then I invite you to visit this website and take a few minutes to kind of see this content in a digestible format. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Will.
All right, I get to talk a little bit about the employee safety and return to work stuff. So I realize that we don't know exactly when our employees are going to return to work. We don't know where this virus is taking us with regard to a scheduling aspect of it, but eventually you're going to need to have some policies and procedures in place for when people actually come back to work, but probably more importantly, you're going to get a lot of questions from your employees about what are we going to do when we come back? Do I actually have to put on, you know, clothes, get out of my pajama pants and go and show up at the office? That's going to be a rough transition for a lot of people. But there's some very important things that you need to think about to protect yourself on the front end so that you don't get in trouble on the back end. Because obviously the most important thing that you need to think about is your employees' safety. We don't want anybody to become a hotbed of the virus, and you also don't want to put your employees in any kind of unsafe situations. So the first thing you need to look at are some of your return to work policies. And let me say up front that the most important thing that you need to be aware of are your own state's shelter in place orders. You know, I know that we've got a lot of people from states all over the country, and everybody's orders are different. And some of those orders have actual teeth in them. Some of them are orders that are just more like suggestions more than actually enforceable deals. I listened to something the other day that was talking about this shelter in place order and how it applied to drive-in churches. I don't know if y'all all saw how that happened, and you had an issue in a community in which they were putting on church services over radio broadcast and had people sitting in their cars in their parking lots, and the community felt that that was still a violation of the shelter in place order and gave everybody tickets, $500 tickets, I'll say that. Now they turned around and solved a lot of that, but that's probably something in which a business thought that they were complying with the shelter in place order by keeping everybody apart, but according to the government, they weren't meeting those requirements. So you really need to be aware of what your shelter in place orders say, not only at the state level, but also at your individual community levels as well. So, and I suggest that with regard to these return to work policies, you start looking at it now, because it sounds like we may not be up and running fully in a lot of communities until probably sometime in the summertime, but you need to start thinking about these policies early. One of the things that you need to think about is how are you going to enforce some sort of social distancing when people get back into your business? And one of the things to consider is a check-in and a check-out system so that you know how many of your employees are in your building at any one particular time. That also applies to the shelter-in-place orders, but it also helps keep your people safe. If you don't want to have more than 10 people in the space that you have, then you need to make sure that you've got a system in place, whether it be signing in, signing out, some sort of just clocking in, clocking out, so you know who is on your facility at any certain time. You also need to think about updating your attendance policies. One of the questions that we're really getting are people who are calling in and saying, I've been able to work from home this entire time. I know that you're updating our policies to say that we need to show up in person, but I don't feel safe coming into the office. If I'm able to continue to do my work over the computer or do it remotely, can I still stay at home? What I've been telling my clients about that question is you need to look at your job descriptions that you've got in place. If your job description has some sort of element of that position where they have to be actually at the office or at the business or, you know, at the front of the store or whatever it needs to be, then you need to make them aware that, I hate to tell you this, but part of your job that is an essential function of your job is I'm going to need you once we're back up and running, actually physically present. And I know that because a lot of our operations have been shut down for the last couple of months, we haven't been engaged in that type of operation, but because we're back up and running fully on X date, part of your essential job function is to be here presently. And most courts around the country have recognized that if you have said that it is important and essential to that job that they be physically present, then that can be enforced. But you need to think with your heart and your head at the same time. If it is something that you're just trying to, you know, be the mean boss and make sure that everybody comes back to work because you're mad that you're having to come back to work, that's not an appropriate reason to come back. But if you do have an actual essential function of somebody that has to be there, then you need to let your employees know up front, these jobs have to be covered physically at the facility. You need to go in, and we could spend an entire hour talking about FMLA leave and talking about the Family's First coronavirus deal. I would encourage, we've got a website that is up on if you go to bradley.com, we have an entire section of our website that deals with the coronavirus and COVID-19 responses. And we've got numerous articles that are put up there that talk about FMLA. You need to go back, review your FMLA under your employees, how many of them are actually eligible for FMLA, how many of them have possibly already taken some FMLA, but you need to enforce all of your policies consistently. We're all going to be tempted to say, when we come back, to say, we need to make everybody happy, we need to make everybody come back. But one of the biggest things that gets employers in trouble is when they don't act consistently. So make sure that if you're going to give Susie some extra time off, that you're also giving Bill the exact same consideration. You need to make sure that you do it consistently and that you document everything. I have a bad feeling that on the other side of opening back up, we're going to see a lot of litigation from people that are going to claim that their employer told them something falsely, or that their employer made them do something, or that their employer terminated them based on a reason that they want to sue over, but they don't necessarily, that it didn't necessarily happen. The best way to beat those kind of lawsuits in the future is if you've got documentation. If you've instructed somebody that we need you to be at work, or here's the safety regulations that we need to follow, and they're not complying with that, make sure you document it. Make sure that you put in place that they are refusing to comply with the safety regulations, so that if you have to terminate them later on and they claim that you did it for some other reason, you can say, here's why I did it, is because we wanted to keep our employees safe. They wouldn't comply with the regulations or the policies we had in place. So make sure you do that. You need to also be aware, have some sort of policy in place for how you're going to deal with an employee who's been diagnosed with COVID-19 or exhibiting symptoms. You obviously don't want them to come in to your place of business and expose everybody else. You also need to have a plan of how to track positive cases and notify those who have been exposed. You know, a lot of places, our firm is a good example, where we have to keep a list of people who have tested positive, so that, I mean, it's a confidential list, but we do have to track and see, have they exposed other staff members, have they exposed other people, and notify those people. All right, if we can skip to the next slide, please. All right, employee safety. Walking through a typical day in your office, you need to think about how, what I've been trying to apply in my home life, in my life of going to pick up groceries or doing things like that. You need to think, how are we going to apply that at the office? Because where you may have been doing a good job of wearing a mask out in public and taking care of your hand washing and making sure that you're staying 6 feet away, just remember that when you get back to work, you're going to have a whole lot of other employees that you're going to have to make sure they're complying with that as well. So one of the things that we suggest is to make sure that you provide additional cleaning and sanitation measures. I've seen a lot of businesses that at the very front of their facility, they've got a hand sanitizing station there. Provide supplies in all common areas, wipes, hand sanitizer, trash cans. With regard to the wearing masks, I mean, you need to comply, again, like I said at the front, of what your state and community is requiring with regard to masks. You need to, I mean, it is a very good thing to do, is to require people to, it's been shown to cut down on transmission of the virus. It's been shown to really help flatten the curve. But if you're going to do it, you need to make sure you do it consistently and say that with regard to our business, with regard to our theater, we're going to require all of our employees to wear masks if they're going to be in public. And make sure you apply that rule consistently. You need to provide clear examples of how to wear those masks and provide them if possible. You need to train your employees on the use of PPE if you're going to require that as well. So let's move on to the next one. All right, employee safety. This seems like a no-brainer, but believe it or not, I've had some clients that have asked about this. If you've got an employee with symptoms, you need to tell them to stay home and have a procedure for how they can call in and tell you that they've got those symptoms. Temperature checks is a big issue right now. Can you implement temperature checks? You have the right under the EEOC's most recent guidance to say that it is a medical procedure that you can require for people when they come in. It's okay to take their temperature, make sure you keep those results confidential, and make sure that you're doing it for everybody if it is job related and that it is a business necessity. Make sure that if you are requiring it, that if you're the boss, that you're actually taking your own temperature as well. Like I said before, most employers get in a lot of trouble when they decide we're going to implement these procedures for some people, but not apply them to everybody. And again, if somebody tests positives, you don't disclose that identity unless they give you the consent in writing to do so. So make sure that you tell people, we need to know if you test positive. We will keep it confidential because we want to keep you away from everybody. But if you'll allow us, we think that we can help others by figuring out if you've had any sort of contact with these people and keep track of that. All right, let me make sure that we move on to the next one. Let me address, I saw one of the questions that came up was a question about changing people's status from salary to hourly. And I didn't really have that in there, but I'm glad that somebody asked that question because that is a very popular question that I'm getting. And most people are doing it for economic reasons. Like they say, we're having to cut back on our staff. We've got some people that we've had as exempt employees. We want to switch them over to be hourly. If you're going to do that, you have to be aware that you're going to have to pay them for every hour worked. And let me tell you where you get in trouble with some of that, especially with people that are working remotely. If you say, look, Susie, I'm going to have to switch you over and make you an hourly employee, you need to tell them they've got to keep track of all their hours. Well, part of the problem is that we're all, talking on these devices right here and talking on email and talking on the phone. And a lot of people don't keep track of the actual hours they're working. The easiest thing I can tell you about the federal law with regard to hourly employees is if they work, they got to get paid. And so if you can get in trouble by switching somebody over to an hourly employee and making the assumption that they're not doing that they're not working when all they're doing is answering emails or they're going on and getting on a conference call. If you call and ask them to answer a question and that answer only takes 2 minutes, that's still time worked that they're entitled to be paid if they're hourly. If they're salaried and you want to say, I'm going to furlough you for a week and make sure that I don't pay you that salary, and you still say, I can't find this file, I don't know where these set of posters are or something like that, I'm going to call Bill and ask him. The minute you call Bill and he answers that question, he's entitled to be paid his week's salary because you've just violated that furlough that you did because you've made them work. And if they're a salaried employee and they work any time during that week, they're entitled to that week's salary. And if they're entitled to an hour, if you switch them over to hourly, you need to be aware that when you switch them over to hourly, they have to write down all their time worked, even remotely. So you don't get a pass just because somebody's in their pajama pants answering your emails. There's no pajama pants exception under the Fair Labor Standards Act. You've got to pay them their hourly wage if they're working. So you need to be really careful on telling your employees to keep essential track of their time that they work. So I think I could talk for a long, long time about, leave and all that kind of stuff. It's going to come up a good bit in the future. But one of the things I will tell you that is very important, and it will cut out a lot of your problems in the future, both through litigation and any sort of claims, is just try to be honest with your employees, try to be transparent with your employees, and just try to be a friend to your employees. Everybody understands that we're going through this uncertain time. The more you just try to communicate and say, we're trying to set up how we're going to open our business back up. We're trying to figure out, do you have any ideas on how we need to do that? The more you communicate back and forth and say, do you have any questions? Do you have any problems? What are some things we're not thinking about? That's going to help you a lot in the future because it really will set up a dialogue. And most of the businesses that don't have to have lawyers like myself or Elizabeth are people that keep up a very healthy dialogue with their employees and are honest with them and say, I'm human, I'm going to make a mistake, but I'm just trying to tell you that let's all learn together as we go through this process. So I think that's all the time I have on that. I know we've got a lot of questions, and so we want to leave a lot of time for questions here at the end. I think a big chunk of them are going to be on Elizabeth's stuff, so I'm going to defer to her as far as going through the questions.
So would you guys, so prior to the webinar, we did offer folks the opportunity to submit questions ahead of time. Will and Elizabeth, you want to tackle those first, and then we'll take a look at the Q&A? Okay.
Absolutely. I've got the first question here that says, for nonprofits using the state reimbursement rather than insurance premium option with workforce development, is there any provision to forgive that reimbursement, or are we still on the hook for it? This is a very good question, and I think that it's state specific. So we do not necessarily have that, and it looks like the person who requested this is from Iowa. So we don't have the information for that state specific issue, but we would be happy to help you find someone who could give you information to answer that question. The next question I have is, we're in California and actors are treated as employees on payroll, but we cannot hire back actors to work on stage, obviously. Therefore, we may add different workers onto payroll to help us. For example, a grant writer or marketing person. Will they count to have the PPP funds forgiven? Okay, so this is kind of an interesting question, and we're hoping to get more clarification on this in the future because the forgiveness process has not had a lot of guidance given for the process, and SBA has promised it will come out soon, but we haven't seen it yet. But we do know that the forgiveness amount, as far as the retention of employees, is based on full-time employee equivalents. So your determination of full-time employee equivalents prior to that 8-week time period, and then the 8-week time period within which you had funds. And I know that there are also some provisions that allow you to rehire somebody prior to June 30th as well and have them count. So there are a lot of intricacies to it. One of the things that they have clarified recently, and I believe it's in FAQ 40 under the guidance that's on the Treasury's website, is that if you're going to rehire someone and have it qualify as rehiring under the calculation, then you have to offer that job back to the same person. And then if they don't agree to have that, to take that job, then you can offer it to someone else, but they're requesting that you give documentation. What I think is interesting though is the question that you all have asked is slightly different than that. It's not that you want to hire the same job. You're not able to hire the same job because you don't need that job any longer, but you're willing to hire people. I think that that is something that they will address in the upcoming guidance. And I think that it is, I think that the goal of this legislation was to make sure that people are employed and hired, but the exact rules of how that will work have not been played out completely. So I know it sounds like we're kind of not answering the question on that, but I wanted to make it clear that the full-time employee equivalence is how the reduction in workforce is determined. And that if you're going to rehire someone that was previously laid off, then you have to offer it to that same person and show documentation of it. The hiring of other people, not sure how that will be handled. The second question from that same individual was, how do we determine the 25% of non-payroll expenses that are forgivable? Is the 25% based on the loan amount? Based on payroll forgiveness? This doesn't seem to, there doesn't seem to be anything that SBA has put in print that definitively clarifies it. So the way that I have interpreted this is, and that it has been interpreted in the guidance, is that the amount that you submit for forgiveness, and that includes payroll costs, utilities, rent, mortgage interest, at least 75% of that forgiveness amount must be for payroll costs. So if you can determine what your payroll costs are that can be forgiven, then that's how you determine your 75%. And then that additional 25% can be used for the other purposes. All right. The next question is on the PPP loan forgiveness. I've received the money. I've brought back all my employees except for one. I've hired some additional employees now to work on online programs. Will they look at who you have brought back or just the payroll amount spent? The answer is they're going to look at both. So there, as we mentioned before when we discussed this, they're going to look at the amount of payroll costs in order to determine how much is able to be forgiven under the loan. But they will also reduce that forgiveness amount if your workforce is reduced. And there's a calculation that basically uses a determinator prior to receiving the funds, and then during that 8-week period compares the amount of people that are full-time employees during that time period. And then you basically have a fraction that is applied to the amount that you received, and it gets reduced. So both of those pieces come into play. All right, I think I've gone through all the questions that we received prior to this. If y'all are okay with this, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so that I can see the chat questions, or maybe I've already been pulled off of there. Let's see.
I have taken you off of
That's
the
great, that's
screen share.
perfect, okay, good.
I did want to allow our attendees a few seconds just to go to the Q&A section of the webinar to upvote. If we can get just a couple seconds there for these guys, we want to make sure that we get the questions that they really, really want to be answered. It looks like the Chris Surface question has jumped up. If you want to just go ahead and jump there.
Okay, it says there is talk of a bill in Congress to extend the 8-week window due to the fact that many businesses are still unable to open. Do you know the status of this? So what I've heard is that there, as you mentioned, there's a bill in Congress that they're trying to get it extended, but I have not heard that it's passed. So as it is currently written, you just have that 8-week window in order to incur and make payments that will incur expenses and make payments that will be forgiven under the loans. I know that a lot of businesses are in that same situation where you're not able to operate and therefore you don't have the employee costs at this time. But you really are in need of assistance. So hopefully there will be something in an upcoming bill that will address that issue. Okay, so the next one we have is our organization only has 2 part-time paid employees. One of those employees has graciously decided to keep working, but not take any pay during our shutdown. We love her for that, but does that open us up for any liability?
Yeah, I can handle this one. Yeah.
I was gonna say, Will, that's for you.
That's very nice. And I'm going to say this up front is everybody has always got some very nice employees who unfortunately later on become plaintiffs because it makes me really nervous to say that somebody is willing to work for free or to be a volunteer. They've got every right in the world to say that they're going to do that, but I would advise you that you really, 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 especially if they're a current employee who is being paid for exactly the same job that they're willing to go and work as a volunteer. I mean, you would have to have, I would get multiple signatures on a waiver to say, I am willing to work for no pay. I am solely going to be a volunteer. But I will tell you, it makes me extremely nervous for a current employee to say, I'm willing to continue to work voluntarily without any sort of pay. It's a very nice thing to do, but you would have to have it very, very well documented that they were terminated as a full-time employee and that if they were going to continue to do any sort of work, they would do it as a volunteer. And I'm not even sure if when they later on, if they filed a lawsuit, that would protect you solely. And I know we had some questions further down in the list about can we just take on volunteers? You can take on a volunteer that is willing to do volunteer work as long as they explicitly understand and explicitly agree. I recognize I am working as a volunteer. I am not a paid employee of this organization, and get that in writing and get them to sign.
Okay, the next one, I think this deals with payroll costs under the PPP, so I'll take this one. Are there any payroll expenses like taxes or unemployment insurance, et cetera, that are not allowed in the permissible purposes? So what you're going to look for there is the definition of payroll costs underneath the CARES Act. And it's also, also in the frequently asked questions, it's going to give that to you. And it's a pretty detailed list. that I don't have right in front of me, but it is easily accessible under treasury.gov to find out what qualifies as a payroll expense. There are certain things that are excluded and certain taxes are excluded, but it gets into pretty granular detail. So what I would say is, if you are, first of all, if you're using an accountant to help you put this together, then, or a bookkeeper, then they are probably a good person to take a look at what is excluded from that to help you figure out what can and cannot be included. Or if not, if you're trying to do it on your own, then I would suggest that you pull that actual legislation or the frequently asked questions so that you can get the specific details that you need for that. Okay, what if we have money left over after the initial 8 weeks of payroll? That's a great question. Okay, so what it does is it's just not forgiven. So if you apply for your forgiveness, you've got 75% of your forgiveness amount is payroll, and your additional 25% is your mortgage, interest, or rent. And then you still have some funds left over that you weren't able to use for whatever reason. Maybe you had a reduction in the amount of employees, or you had less expenses or something of that nature. In that case, if you decide to keep the funds, then it is just a loan. And so your balance of the loan will be whatever is remaining after the forgiveness. And it will go back to the normal repayment terms that you would have other than in the absence of the forgiveness. So if you had not gotten any forgiven, that would have been, it's deferred for 6 months, but the interest still accrues, and then you pay it back once the loan matures. So it just turns into a regular loan. Okay, can you share details about forgiveness for the PPP? I'm in California and we have recently received the loan, but are still restricted from opening because of our state and county health mandates. Therefore, we cannot bring employees back to work yet. Only one employee remains on payroll, taking care of essential administrative duties. Will a portion of this loan be forgiven to cover the single salary along with the other covered expenses, even though we will not be able to return to normal payroll levels due to the health restrictions? This is a great question. I think it kind of hits on what we talked about earlier. I don't know that you are going to be able to go outside of that 8-week window, like we talked about previously, unless there is some additional legislation that's passed that allows for that. But the payroll that you are incurring now can be used to get at least some forgiveness. And that would be what I would present to your lender, is whatever expenses you actually can get forgiven, I would do that. And then the rest of the remaining funds would be kept as a loan, unless you repeat it. Okay, here you go, Will. This is for you. You want to take that one?
Yeah, it's kind of what I said before. You can still take on volunteer. This is a little easier question. If you've got somebody who is laid off from another job that wants to just come volunteer for you, obviously you handle that the same way you handle normal volunteers that come and help out at the theater. But again, like I said before, if you've got someone who has been laid off from your own business and you want to switch them over to become a volunteer, again, makes me nervous. You can sign all the kinds of releases that you want. I'm not so sure it'll protect you, but you just need to have a definite understanding that they have been terminated as a paid employee and that they are no longer going to get paid, and just cross your fingers past that.
Okay, I think this next question has to do with the EIDL loans. And it says, Ohio is accepting only agricultural at this time. Did we miss that vote? This has been an interesting development that has happened really recently. And I have not seen anything as far as a formal policy, but I have heard from different news sources that the EIDL loans may be limited to $150,000 and only available to certain groups. I don't know, truthfully, I don't know what this is based on, and the articles that I've seen are not exactly sure what is driving this. But it seems to be in practice that there is a limitation right now on the EIDL loans as far as the amount of funds available and who they're going to accept applications from. Will, you want to take the next one?
The next one is dealing with the hourly, and I think I talked a little bit about this at the very beginning. At the beginning we were talking about questions. If you're going to move them to hourly, you need to make sure that you get them to sign a new job description that describes them as working hourly. Make sure that they understand they are going to clock in and clock out and keep track of every single hour that they do. And and make sure that you change that job description. And my suggestion would be to change it to say, pursuant to COVID-19, this position will now be an hourly position and expected to work the following hours and do the following duties. Have them sign that deal. Make sure they keep track of their time, as I mentioned, even if they're working remotely. Then you also need to make sure if you're going to switch them back to full-time exempt, they meet all the requirements for that classification later on. Once you're back up and running, you put up a new job, another job description, goes back to the way that they were. Have them sign that job description so that they understand that they're exempt and how their duties have changed once you get back up and running.
Okay. I believe that our time has run out. Are we at the end point for our availability to get questions now? I think we've hit the hour-long mark.
We have. And so I hope everyone saw their email and got their email. If you have any follow-up questions, as Will and Elizabeth said, please feel free to email them and they'll point you in the right direction to getting some of those things answered. Again, Will, Elizabeth, Lynn, I thank you for coming on, and sharing your expertise with us and talking us through this, because we are really in uncharted waters and it changes day by day, week by week. And so we appreciate your time and sharing what you know with us. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day. Yeah.
Thanks, y'all. Hang in there. Be safe.